I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The heavy scent of damp earth and late-blooming wisteria hung over the gardens of Blackwood Manor, where the village of Chipping Deeping had gathered for the annual Michaelmas fete. It was a picture of English serenity, the rhythmic thud of a cricket ball in the distance, the gentle clink of china from the tea tent, and the brightly coloured bunting fluttering against the weathered grey stone of the manor. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her sensible tweed suit and a hat adorned with a slightly wilted silk rose, sat on a folding chair near the tombola stall. To anyone passing by, she was merely a frail, elderly lady, intently focused on her knitting. In truth, she was observing the delicate social ecosystem of the village with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She watched Lady Arabella Blackwood, the manor's mistress, whose smile was as brittle as the meringue she was serving. Lady Arabella was a woman who lived for appearances, yet her hands trembled slightly as she handed a plate to the local curate. Nearby, her husband, Sir Geoffrey, stood in the shadow of a large oak, nursing a glass of sherry and looking perpetually irritated. Miss Marple noted how he pointedly avoided the gaze of Julian Vane, the handsome young architect currently renovating the manor's east wing. Julian was laughing too loudly, his eyes darting toward the manor's balcony, where a young auburn-haired woman sat in a wheelchair, watching the festivities with a look of profound melancholy. This was Elspeth, the Blackwoods' only daughter, who had been confined to that chair since a tragic riding accident the previous winter. "It's a lovely turnout, isn't it, Jane?" chirped Mrs. Pringle, the village postmistress, settling into the chair beside her. "Though I must say the atmosphere feels a bit strained this year. Since that new valet arrived from London, Sir Geoffrey hasn't been himself, always whispering in the library. They are." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. "Whispers can be so very loud in a quiet house, Clara. It reminds me of poor Mr. Ebbsley back in St. Mary Mead. He used to whisper to his prize-winning dahlias, and everyone thought it was quite charming, until we discovered he was actually rehearsing his arguments for the local council meetings." The conversation was abruptly cut short by a sound that did not belong to a village fete. It wasn't a scream, but rather a dull, heavy thud followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. The noise had come from the library, whose tall French doors opened directly onto the terrace. For a moment, the village fell silent, the cricket game frozen in mid-motion. Then the scream did come. It was the housemaid, Mary, who had gone inside to replenish the lemon squash. She stumbled out onto the terrace, her face the colour of bleached bone, clutching her throat. "Sir Geoffrey!" she gasped, pointing back into the shadows of the library. "In the chair. He's had a terrible turn." The crowd surged forward, but Miss Marple remained still for a moment, her pale blue eyes fixed not on the library but on the balcony above. Elspeth was no longer sitting in her wheelchair. The chair was empty, its wheels still spinning slowly, while a single white glove lay on the stone floor of the balcony. Inside the library, the scene was one of staged tragedy. Sir Geoffrey sat slumped in his high-backed leather chair, a half-finished glass of sherry on the table beside him. On the floor lay a heavy bronze statuette of a hunting dog, its base stained with a dark, viscous fluid. The large stained-glass window behind the desk was shattered, shards of coloured light scattered across the Persian rug, like fallen jewels. It looked for all the world like a burglary gone wrong, a desperate intruder caught in the act. Miss Marple edged to the front of the gathering, her gaze moving from the shattered window to the fireplace. A small, charred fragment of paper was fluttering in the hearth, caught in a draught. She noted, with a sharp intake of breath, that despite the warm afternoon, a fire had been laid but not lit. It was a very small detail, one that the local constable would surely overlook, but to Jane Marple it suggested a calculated preparation. Sir Geoffrey was dead, and the piece of Chipping Deeping had been expertly dismantled. By the time the evening mist began to roll off the meadows and curl around the base of the manor's stone walls, the village of Chipping Deeping was a hive of frantic, hushed activity. The Michaelmas fete had been abandoned, leaving behind a surreal landscape of half-eaten sandwiches and limp bunting that flapped dismally in the breeze. Inside the manor's great hall, the air was thick with the smell of floor wax and the unmistakable metallic tang of cold fear. The guests had been ushered into the hall to wait for the arrival of the county police, and in that forced proximity, the social barriers that usually kept the village in check began to erode. Miss Marple sat on a stiff-backed oak bench, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic, soothing click that seemed to irritate the more high-strung members of the group. The village's reaction was a fascinating study in human self-preservation. Mrs. Pringle, the postmistress, was already holding court in a corner, her voice a piercing whisper that carried further than she likely intended. She was convinced that the crime was the work of a professional syndicate from the city, citing a suspiciously shiny black motor car she claimed to have seen parked near the lane. It was a classic diversion. Miss Marple recalled how the village of St. Mary Mead had once convinced itself that a wandering circus troupe had stolen the vicar's silver, simply because it was easier to blame strangers than to admit the churchwarden had a gambling debt. The human mind, Jane reflected, always preferred a dramatic intruder over a familiar face. Lady Arabella stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp and rigid against the flickering orange light. She was not weeping. Instead, she was giving crisp, low-voiced instructions to the butler about the evening's arrangements, as if a murder were merely a social gaffe that required a change in seating. However, Miss Marple noticed that her ladyship's eyes remained fixed on the heavy library doors, and her fingers were compulsively twisting a strand of pearls until the skin beneath them turned red. Julian Vane, the architect, was pacing near the windows, his usual charm replaced by a defensive, sullen silence. He kept glancing toward the stairs, looking for Elspeth, who had been carried to her room in a state of alleged collapse after the discovery of the empty wheelchair. "It's the tragedy of the Blackwood blood," murmured Mr. Henderson, the local schoolmaster, leaning toward Miss Marple with an air of scholarly gloom. "Geoffrey was a hard man, Jane. He had a way of squeezing people until they had nothing left. Look at the way he treated that young valet, Dawkins. The boy looked like he was walking on eggshells every time Sir Geoffrey entered a room. And then there's the matter of the estate's debt. It's no secret that the renovations were costing more than the family could afford. Desperate times, as they say, lead to desperate acts by those who stand to inherit." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her mind was cataloguing the inconsistencies in his tone. "Desperation is a very powerful spring, Mr. Henderson. It reminds me of the old miller's daughter who broke her own father's prized clock just so he wouldn't see she'd been late for her chores. But what I find so very peculiar is the scream. Poor Mary the maid didn't scream when she saw the body. She screamed when she looked at the broken window. I wonder why that should be. A body is a much more shocking thing than a bit of broken glass, surely." The room grew momentarily quieter as the village took in this observation. The flawed theories continued to swirl. Some blamed a disgruntled tenant. Others suggested Sir Geoffrey had been involved in some clandestine business in London that had finally caught up with him. Each character offered a piece of the puzzle that was coloured by their own prejudices. The curate suggested a sudden fit of madness, while the local doctor spoke of apoplexy before the blow was struck. They were all looking for a reason that didn't involve themselves, creating a cacophony of blame that served as a perfect screen for the true perpetrator. Miss Marple listened to it all, her pale eyes never losing their sharpness. She saw the way the valet, Dawkins, stood in the shadows of the gallery, his expression not of grief, but of a strange, watchful anticipation. She noticed how Lady Arabella pointedly ignored the architect, and how the architect, in turn, seemed terrified of the stairs. The village was reacting exactly as she expected, by building a wall of noise to hide the silence of the truth. As the heavy tread of the police finally echoed in the driveway, Miss Marple knew that the gossip was merely the first layer of dust on a very old and very dark secret. The peace of chipping deeping was gone, replaced by a ruthless game of musical chairs where the music had stopped, and Sir Geoffrey had been left without a seat. Inspector Slack's arrival at Blackwood Manor was accompanied by the heavy scent of wet wool, and an air of impatient authority that immediately set the village on edge. He was a man who preferred a blunt instrument over a subtle clue, and he began his investigation by stomping through the library with a squad of constables, barking orders that seemed designed more to intimidate the living than to respect the dead. While Slack focused his energy on the shattered window and the obvious placement of the bronze hunting dog, Miss Marple remained in the hallway, seated on a small velvet settee that afforded her a clear view of the library's threshold. She was knitting a pair of baby booties in a soft, unassuming blue, her needles clicking a quiet counterpoint to the inspector's booming voice. The early investigation was a masterclass in the obvious. Slack was delighted by the broken stained glass, immediately deducing that an intruder had climbed the trellis, entered the library to steal the collection of rare coins Sir Geoffrey kept in the desk, and struck the master of the house when surprised. He spent nearly an hour measuring the distance from the trellis to the windowsill, ignoring the fact that the delicate wisteria vines clinging to the wood were entirely undisturbed. Miss Marple, watching through the open door, noted that not a single leaf had been crushed, nor a single bloom shaken loose. It reminded her of the time the churchwarden's wife claimed a burglar had entered through the pantry, forgetting that she had polished the floor that morning and left it without a single scuff mark. "It's a clear-cut case of housebreaking, Sergeant," Slack announced, his voice echoing into the hall. The thief panicked, grabbed the nearest heavy object, this bronze dog, and delivered the fatal blow. "We'll check the local registers for any known ruffians in the county, and I want a full statement from that valet, Dawkins. He has a shifty look about him, and he was the last one to see Sir Geoffrey alive before the tea service." Miss Marple sighed softly, her eyes following a small, dark beetle as it crawled across the floorboards toward the library. While the police were obsessed with the height of the window, she was looking at the fireplace. The charred fragment of paper she had noticed earlier was still there, caught in the grate. She also observed something the inspector had dismissed as mere household clutter. A small silver tray on the side table held 2 glasses of sherry, not one. Both glasses had been drained, yet the maid had only reported seeing Sir Geoffrey in the room. This discrepancy in the tea for one narrative was a pattern she had seen before. People often forget that even a dead man leaves behind the shadow of his last companion. As the constables began to move the body, Miss Marple rose and wandered toward the kitchen passage, where the staff were huddled in a state of muted hysteria. She found Dawkins, the valet, leaning against the cold stone wall, his face a mask of practiced indifference. However, he was compulsively polishing a silver button on his sleeve, his movements frantic and repetitive. Miss Marple paused beside him, adjusting her shawl. "It is a very difficult time for a young man in your position, Dawkins," she said gently, her voice like a soft breeze. "To lose a master so suddenly. I suppose you were quite busy during the fete, what with the constant errands and the extra guests. I noticed you were heading toward the east wing just before the accident. Such a long walk for a tray of refreshments." Dawkins flinched, his hand momentarily stopping its polishing. "I was only doing my duty, miss. Sir Geoffrey was particular about his afternoon drink. He didn't like to be kept waiting, fete or no fete." Of course," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting toward his shoes. They were immaculate, save for a tiny, peculiar streak of white dust on the heel. The same fine, chalky dust that Julian Vane used for his architectural renderings in the East Wing. "Duty is so very important," It's the glue that holds a house together, isn't it? Though sometimes the glue can get quite messy if one isn't careful. Like poor Mr. Henderson's glue in the schoolroom, he tried to fix a broken desk and ended up sticking his own sleeves to the lid. She moved away before he could respond, leaving him with a look of sudden, sharp suspicion. Miss Marple knew that the inspector was chasing a phantom intruder, a ghost in a cloth cap who would never be found. She, however, was interested in the lie's architecture, the empty wheelchair on the balcony, the 2 glasses of sherry, the undisturbed wisteria, and the white dust on the valet's heel were the true patterns of the crime. They suggested a domestic tragedy disguised as a public outrage. As she returned to her seat, she felt a familiar, cold certainty. Sir Geoffrey had not been murdered by a stranger. He had been executed by someone who knew exactly how the house breathed. By the following morning, Inspector Slack's initial theory of a wandering burglar had crystallized into a much more convenient and satisfying shape. The obvious suspect had emerged in the form of Dawkins, the valet, whose room had been searched during the early hours of the dawn. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near his washstand, the constables had discovered a leather pouch containing several of Sir Geoffrey's rare gold sovereigns and a heavy, ornate fob watch that had been seen on the master's desk only hours before the murder. To Slack, this was the definitive end of the matter. He viewed the case as a textbook example of a servant's greed turned violent. He was already preparing his report, convinced that Dawkins had staged the burglary by breaking the window from the inside after killing his master in a fit of panicked theft. Miss Marple sat in the small morning room of the Manor, having been invited to stay by a distraught Lady Arabella, who seemed to find the elderly woman's presence strangely grounding. As the inspector marched through the hall, his boots echoing with the sound of a man who believed he had won a great victory, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Her pale blue eyes were clouded with a gentle, persistent doubt. She had known many young men like Dawkins, boys who were perhaps a bit light-fingered when it came to a stray coin or a forgotten cigar, but who lacked the cold, calculating steel required to shatter a man's skull and then sit down to a polite tea. In her experience, a thief who kills in a panic does not stop to hide his loot under his own floorboards. He flings it into the nearest pond or carries it as far as his legs can take him. "It is very efficient of the inspector, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Pringle, who had dropped by under the guise of delivering a telegram, "to find exactly what he was looking for in the very first place he looked. It reminds me of the time when old Mrs. Partridge lost her spectacles and found them inside the refrigerator. She was so certain they had been stolen by the milkman until she realized she had put them there herself while she was putting away the butter. Sometimes, when a thing is too easy to find, it's because someone wanted it to be found." Mrs. Pringle gasped, her eyes widening. "You don't mean to say that someone planted those coins, Jane? That would mean a cold-blooded conspiracy." "But the inspector is so sure. He says Dawkins has no alibi for the 10 minutes preceding the maid's scream. Apparently he was seen skulking near the library by Julian Vane." "Ah, yes, Mr. Vane," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking at a rhythmic, thoughtful pace. "A very observant young man. It is fortunate he was there to see so much. And yet, I find myself thinking about the wheelchair. If Dawkins was busy stealing coins and breaking windows, why would he bother to move Elspeth's chair? And where, for that matter, was the poor girl herself? One doesn't simply vanish from a balcony in a wheelchair unless one has a very good reason, or a very good assistant." The police were eager to close the case, and the village was equally eager to see the shifty valet led away in handcuffs. It restored the natural order of chipping deeping, to believe that the rot had come from the lower classes rather than the heart of the manor itself. Lady Arabella appeared at the doorway, her face a mask of tragic dignity, though Miss Marple noted the way she kept glancing at the architect, Julian Vane, who was standing by the sideboard. Vane was looking remarkably relaxed for a man whose employer had just been murdered. He was sipping a cup of coffee and discussing the stability of the East Wing's masonry, as if the tragedy were merely a minor interruption in his construction schedule. Miss Marple remained unconvinced by the inspector's triumph. She knew Dawkins was a convenient scapegoat, a man whose social position made him easy to blame and hard to defend. But the physical evidence simply didn't fit the character of a frantic robbery. A man stealing coins does not stop to drain a second glass of sherry, nor does he take care to ensure that the wisteria on the trellis remains undamaged. The crime was too tidy in some places and too messy in others. As Slack began to lead a protest, weeping Dawkins toward the waiting police car, Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of alarm. The obvious suspect was a screen, and behind that screen, the true killer was already beginning to breathe a sigh of relief. She looked at the white dust still visible on the edge of the hallway rug and knew that the real investigation had only just begun. The morning sun filtered through the tall, mullioned windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air of the library. While Inspector Slack was busy at the police station conducting a formal interrogation of the terrified Dawkins, Miss Marple had returned to the scene of the crime. She moved with a quiet, bird-like grace, her eyes scanning the room not for the large, obvious signs of violence, but for the minute discrepancies that indicated a life interrupted. The police had cordoned off the area with yellow tape, but Lady Arabella had given Miss Marple leave to collect her knitting bag, which she had conveniently left on a side table the previous evening. It was a small deception, one that Jane felt was entirely justified in the pursuit of a much larger truth. She stood by the mahogany desk where Sir Geoffrey had met his end. The bloodstain on the rug had darkened to a deep brownish purple, but it was not the gore that held her attention. Instead, she leaned over to examine the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the shattered window. There, caught in the thick pile of the fabric at roughly knee-height, was a single tiny filament of vibrant green silk. It was a peculiar shade, reminiscent of a tropical beetle's wing. Miss Marple retrieved it with a pair of small tweezers from her purse, holding it up to the light. It was not a thread from a common wool suit, nor was it consistent with the rough cotton of a maid's uniform or a valet's livery. It was the sort of silk one found in expensive evening wear, or perhaps a very specific type of decorative embroidery. Her gaze then shifted to the floor beneath the desk. The constables had swept the area for fingerprints and glass shards, but they had missed a small circular indentation in the heavy Persian rug, a few inches away from where Sir Geoffrey's feet would have rested. Miss Marple knelt down, her joints protesting slightly, and touched the mark. It was deep and localized, as if something very heavy with a small rounded base had been pressed into the wool for a significant amount of time. It was not the mark of a chair leg, nor of the bronze hunting dog that had been used as a weapon. It reminded her of the pressure marks left by the heavy iron legs of a medical apparatus, or perhaps the specialized stoppers of a modern wheelchair. A very curious thing, she murmured to herself, her mind darting back to the image of Elspeth on the balcony. To be in two places at once is quite a feat, even for the most determined of young women. She then turned her attention to the fireplace, which had been cold during the heat. She recalled the charred fragment of paper she had seen earlier. Most of it had crumbled to ash under the inspector's heavy-handed search, but a tiny sliver remained wedged in the corner of the grate. She teased it out delicately. On the unburnt edge, she could just make out the letters Timmis's, written in a crisp architectural hand. It was not Sir Geoffrey's sprawling, aggressive script. It was precise, measured, and utterly deliberate. The word seemed to be part of a Latin phrase, perhaps optimus, meaning the best or most favourable. It was a word an architect might use when describing a plan, or a dreamer might use when describing a future. Miss Marple sat in Sir Geoffrey's chair, closing her eyes to envision the room as it had been. The 2 glasses of sherry suggested a guest, but the shattered window suggested an intruder. If the window had been broken from the inside to simulate a burglary, the glass should have fallen mostly onto the terrace. She remembered the shards she had seen. They were scattered equally across the rug and the stone outside. This meant the window had been broken while it was already standing open, a redundant act of violence meant only to provide a visual cue for the police. It was a theatrical flourish, like the time the village schoolmaster had faked a robbery by overturning his own desks, forgetting that a real thief wouldn't bother to arrange the chairs in such a neat circle afterward. This minor detail, the green thread, the indentation in the rug, and the architectural fragment, stood out to her like a discordant note in a familiar melody. To Inspector Slack they were nothing. To the village they were invisible. But to Jane Marple they suggested that the crime was not a sudden act of greed by a valet, but a meticulously choreographed performance. The valet had been framed not just with coins, but with a narrative that played upon the inspector's prejudices. As she tucked the green thread into a small envelope, she realized that the disappearance of Elspeth from the balcony was the true center of the mystery. The girl hadn't vanished, she had been moved, and the person who moved her had left a trail of green silk and white architectural dust in their wake. The following morning, the oppressive silence of Blackwood Manor was replaced by a restless, shivering energy as the village of Chipping Deeping began to pick at the scabs of its own history. Miss Marple, realizing that the library held no more secrets for the moment, relocated herself to the local post office and tea room, the undisputed center of the village's information exchange. As she sipped a cup of lukewarm Darjeeling, she watched the local residents drift in and out, each of them carrying a heavy burden of "I told you so, and if only you knew." It was a familiar ritual. In a small town, a murder acts like a heavy rain that washes away the topsoil, exposing the jagged rocks of old resentments and long-buried betrayals that everyone had agreed to ignore for the sake of polite society. Mrs. Pringle was particularly forthcoming, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial thrum as she leaned over the counter toward Miss Marple. It appeared that Sir Geoffrey's financial solvency had been a carefully maintained fiction for nearly a decade, the postmistress whispered, about a series of registered letters from London banks that had become increasingly frequent and aggressive in the months leading up to the Michaelmas fete. Sir Geoffrey had been gambling not with cards, but with the very land the village sat upon, mortgaging tenant farms to pay for the lavish renovations of the East Wing. This revelation cast Julian Vane, the architect, in a far more predatory light. If the renovations were a cover for a desperate financial maneuver, Vane was not just an employee but a co-conspirator, or perhaps a blackmailer. And then there is the matter of poor Elspeth's accident, Mrs. Pringle added, her eyes darting to the door. People say it was a fall from a horse, but Julian Vane was the one who was with her that day. Sir Geoffrey never forgave him, yet he kept him on at the manor. Why would a father keep the man he blamed for his daughter's paralysis in his own home? Unless, of course, the young man knew something that Sir Geoffrey couldn't afford to have made public. There were rumours, Jane, dreadful rumours about a previous marriage Sir Geoffrey had contracted in his youth, one that might have made his union with Lady Arabella entirely invalid. Miss Marple listened, her mind drawing parallels to the unfortunate case of the village apothecary in St. Mary Mead, who had kept a poisonous secret for 20 years, only to have it revealed by a misplaced receipt. She thought of Lady Arabella's brittle smile and her rigid insistence on decorum. If her marriage were a sham, she would be left with nothing. No title, no manor, and no standing in the county she so desperately craved to rule. The motive for murder was no longer a simple matter of a valet's greed. It was a sprawling map of survival and spite. Every member of the inner circle at Blackwood Manor now had a reason to see Sir Geoffrey silenced forever, the wife protecting her status, the daughter seeking revenge for her shattered life, and the architect fighting to secure his own ambitious future. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple encountered Julian Vane himself near the village green. He was carrying a roll of blueprints, his face set in a mask of professional concern, yet there was a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. He stopped to offer Miss Marple a polite greeting, but his eyes were constantly scanning the road behind her. She noted the way he gripped his leather case, the knuckles white, the leather strained. "A terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a fraction too loud. "I only hope the police wrap things up quickly. The uncertainty is doing no one any favours, especially not Lady Arabella." "Uncertainty is a very heavy thing to carry, Mr. Vane," Miss Marple replied, her tone deceptively mild. "It reminds me of the old clock tower in the square. Everyone thinks it's solid until the day the inner gears finally grind to a halt." "I was just admiring the green silk embroidery on your waistcoat yesterday. Such a vibrant colour, quite like a thread I happened to find in the library." "I don't suppose you've lost any stitching lately. Construction sites can be very hard on one's wardrobe." Vane froze, his gaze sharpening with a sudden predatory intensity that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He gave a forced, hollow laugh and adjusted his coat. "I'm afraid I haven't noticed, Miss Marple. I've been far too busy with the East Wing to worry about my waistcoat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must get back to the Manor. There are details that require my immediate attention." As he walked away, Miss Marple watched him with a look of profound sadness. The relationships in the Manor were not built on affection, but on a series of interlocking fears. The architect was tied to the daughter was tied to the mother, and they were all tied to the dead man by a rope of lies that was finally beginning to fray. The whispers Mrs. Pringle had mentioned were not just gossip. They were the sound of the Manor's foundation, cracking under the weight of a truth that was too large to remain hidden. She realized then that the valet was merely a pawn in a much larger game of chess, one played with human lives as the stakes. The following morning brought with it a revelation so startling that it momentarily silenced the local chatter regarding the valet's impending trial. Inspector Slack had returned to the Manor not to release Dawkins, but to announce that the London police had discovered a second, ransacked apartment in Soho belonging to the very same valet. It appeared the young man had been living a double life under an assumed name, acting as a fence for stolen jewellery. This news seemed to hammer the final nail into the coffin of his innocence, providing a history of professional criminality that Slack found irresistible. The village immediately pivoted, their earlier doubts replaced by a self-righteous satisfaction that the outsider was indeed a villain of the highest order. Miss Marple, however, found this sudden windfall of evidence deeply suspicious. She sat in the Manor's small conservatory, surrounded by the scent of damp moss and overripe ferns, watching Julian Vane and Lady Arabella through the glass. They were walking together on the terrace, their heads bowed in what looked like an intimate shared confidence. To the rest of the world, it was a widow seeking counsel from a trusted family friend. To Miss Marple, it looked like two people carefully aligning their stories before the tide could turn. She knew that in the world of high-stakes deception, a second crime or a convenient discovery of a secret life was often the most effective way to bury the truth under a mountain of plausible noise. It was during this period of supposed clarity that the other twist occurred. A local boy, searching for crawfish in the stream that ran along the edge of the Blackwood estate, pulled a heavy, sodden bundle from the reeds. When the police unwrapped the oilcloth, they found not more stolen coins but a discarded, blood-stained, green silk shawl and a pair of surgical shears. This discovery sent the investigation spiraling in a new direction. The presence of the shawl, the very same shade of vibrant green Miss Marple had noted earlier, seemed to point toward a female accomplice. The inspector immediately shifted his focus toward the kitchen staff, convinced that one of the maids had been Dawkins' lover and partner in crime. Miss Marple watched the police scramble with a sense of weary disappointment. They were following the breadcrumbs exactly as the killer had intended. She decided to pay a visit to Elspeth in the East Wing, bypassing the main staircase and using the small service lift that the servants used for laundry. She found the young woman sitting by the window, her auburn hair loose about her shoulders, staring out at the gardens with a vacant intensity. The empty wheelchair sat in the corner, looking strangely clinical and cold. On the bedside table lay a small, leather-bound volume of Latin poetry, the same type of book that might contain the word Optimus in a crisp architectural hand. "It is a beautiful view, Elspeth," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into the room, "though I imagine it must be very frustrating to watch the world go by from up here, especially when things are happening below that require one's presence. I was just thinking about that green shawl the police found in the stream. It was such a lovely colour. It reminded me so much of the one you were wearing in that photograph on the piano downstairs, the one taken before your accident." Elspeth didn't turn her head, but Miss Marple saw the girl's reflection in the window pane. Her eyes were no longer vacant, they were sharp and guarded. "That shawl was lost months ago, Miss Marple. I haven't seen it since the winter. I suppose someone must have found it in the attic and used it for their own purposes. My life is full of things that have been lost or broken. My father's death is just the latest in a long line of tragedies." "Yes, your father was a very difficult man," Miss Marple agreed, her voice remaining conversational. "Especially regarding your friendship with Mr. Vane. He felt Julian was responsible for your fall, didn't he? And he was very firm about his disapproval. It's a terrible thing when a father's love turns into a prison. It reminds me of the old blacksmith in St. Mary Mead who locked his daughter in her room to keep her from the village fair. She eventually escaped, of course, but the cost was quite high for everyone involved." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Marple noted that the surgical shears found in the stream were of a professional grade, the kind used by private nurses or those accustomed to medical equipment. The twist of the hidden shawl was not a clue leading to a maid. It was a carefully placed piece of theatre designed to explain away the green thread in the library, while simultaneously linking the crime to a shadowy female accomplice who didn't exist. The true killer was reinforcing the deception by providing the police with exactly what they wanted, more physical evidence. But as Miss Marple looked at the young woman in the chair, she saw the strength in those arms and the cold fire in those eyes. The deception was failing, not because it wasn't clever, but because it was too perfect. The following afternoon, Miss Marple decided that the time for subtle observation had passed, and the time for a gentle yet calculated confrontation had arrived. She sought out Julian Vane in the partially renovated east wing of the Manor, a place of skeletonized walls and the pervasive scent of fresh sawdust and lime. The architect was perched on a high stool, hunched over a drafting table, with a focused intensity that bordered on the feverish. The light from the high windows caught the dust in the air, creating an almost ecclesiastical atmosphere that felt entirely at odds with the dark undercurrents of the past few days. Miss Marple entered with a soft, apologetic cough, her knitting bag draped over her arm like a shield of domestic innocence. "Oh, Mr. Vane, do forgive me for intruding," she began, her voice fluttering with a simulated elderly nervousness. "I was looking for Lady Arabella, but I seem to have taken a wrong turn. This house is quite a labyrinth, is it not? Though I suppose for a man of your talents, it is all perfectly logical. Like a puzzle where every piece must fit precisely into its designated slot. I was just admiring the craftsmanship of these new arches. They are so very solid, so very permanent. It must be a great comfort to build things that last, especially when human life proves to be so terribly fleeting." Julian Vane straightened, his hand tightening around a drafting pencil. He offered a smile that was polite but did not reach his eyes, which remained cold and watchful. "Logic is the only thing that keeps a structure standing, Miss Marple. Without it, Everything collapses into chaos. "I'm afraid Lady Arabella is in the garden with the vicar. Is there something I can help you with, or are you just admiring the masonry?" Miss Marple moved closer to the table, her eyes darting over his sketches. "Actually, I was thinking about your Latin, that charred scrap in the library, the word optimus. It's such a strong word, isn't it? The best. My nephew Raymond tells me it's often used in architectural mottos. It reminded me so much of a case in St. Mary Mead, the tragedy of the local clockmaker. He was obsessed with perfection. He wanted to build a clock that would never lose a second. He was so determined to control time that he ended up trying to control the people around him too. He didn't realize that people are much more unpredictable than gears and springs." She paused, watching the way Vane's jaw set. The psychological pressure was subtle, but the reaction was there, a slight tremor in his fingers as he laid down the pencil. "I was also thinking about the physics of a wheelchair," she continued, her tone conversational. "It's a marvelous invention for those who cannot walk, but it is also a very heavy object. To lift it, say, over a door sill or onto a terrace requires a great deal of strength, and it leaves such distinct marks on a soft rug, don't you think? Like the marks I found near Sir Geoffrey's desk. It occurred to me that if one were trying to stage a burglary, one would have to be very careful about where one placed the furniture. One wouldn't want to leave the impression that a guest had been sitting quite so close to the victim." Vane stood up, his height intended to be intimidating. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Miss Marple. If you have some theory about the crime, perhaps you should take it to Inspector Slack. He seems quite satisfied with the valet as our culprit. The evidence in London was quite damning, was it not?" "Evidence is only as good as the person who finds it," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze holding his. "And Inspector Slack is a man who finds what he expects to see. But I found something he didn't. I found a second glass of sherry, Mr. Vane. And I found a pair of immaculate shoes with white architectural dust on the heels. It made me wonder why a valet would be in the East Wing just before a murder, or why an architect would be in the library during a tea service, unless of course they were working together, or perhaps unless one was being used by the other to create a very elaborate distraction." She watched him closely, waiting for the crack in the facade. The test was simple. If he were merely an accomplice, he would bluster or deny. But Julian Vane did something far more revealing. He didn't look angry, he looked toward the door leading to Elspeth's room, a flicker of genuine agonizing fear crossing his face. It wasn't fear for himself, but for her. At that moment, Miss Marple understood the true nature of the conspiracy. It wasn't a crime of greed, but a desperate romantic pact between two people who felt they had no other way to be together. Vane wasn't the mastermind, he was the protector, and by threatening the narrative, Miss Marple had struck at the only thing he truly cared about. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat as the realization took hold. The old woman in the tweed suit had seen through the blueprints of his soul. The following morning, Miss Marple requested a final gathering in the Manor's great hall, a room where the cold stone walls seemed to lean inward with the weight of centuries. Inspector Slack was present, looking impatient and clutching a briefcase he intended to take to the Crown Prosecutor, while Lady Arabella sat by the hearth, her posture a defiant monument to family pride. Julian Vane stood by the windows, his silhouette dark against the grey sky, and Elspeth sat in her wheelchair, her hands folded primly over a wool blanket. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, and the underlying chill of a house that had lost its master. Miss Marple sat in a small chair in the centre of the room, her knitting needles tucked away, her expression one of profound maternal sadness. "It is a tragedy of errors, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and clear, "but not the errors of a common thief. We have been looking for an intruder who climbed a trellis, yet the wisteria was never disturbed. We found gold coins in a valet's room, yet the coins were found far too easily. as if they were placed there by someone who knew exactly where the police would look first. The crime we are investigating was not a robbery gone wrong, but a meticulously planned execution carried out by two people who felt they were fighting for their lives. It was a partnership of necessity, born from the cruelty of a man who used his wealth and his daughter's disability as a leash. Inspector Slack scoffed, tapping his briefcase. "The valet had the watch, Miss Marple. He had the coins. He has a criminal record in London. What more do you want?" "I want the truth of the 2 glasses of sherry, Inspector," she replied gently. "Sir Geoffrey did not drink alone. He was joined by someone he trusted, or at least someone he felt he still controlled. That person was not the valet. The valet, Dawkins, was indeed a petty thief, and the killer knew it. They used his existing dishonesty as a shield, planting the coins to ensure the police would look no further. But the person who sat with Sir Geoffrey was his daughter Elspeth, and the person who stood outside that window waiting for the signal to break the glass and create the illusion of a burglary was Julian Vane. It was a performance designed to free them both from Sir Geoffrey's tyranny." A sharp gasp escaped Lady Arabella, but Elspeth remained perfectly still. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the young woman. "You see, Inspector, the accident that paralyzed Elspeth was the first lie. She has been recovering for months, a secret kept between her and the man she loves, Mr. Vane. Sir Geoffrey had discovered the truth. He knew she could walk, and he knew she intended to flee with Julian. He was going to disinherit her and ruin Vane's career. That is what the charred Optimus's fragment was, the remnants of a new will that Sir Geoffrey was preparing to sign. On the day of the feast, Elspeth stood up from that chair, took the bronze hunting dog from the desk and struck the blow that ended her father's life. She then signalled Julian, who broke the window from the terrace to support the story of an intruder. "That's preposterous," Julian Vane shouted, stepping forward. "She's a cripple. She couldn't have—" "She is a very determined young woman, Mr. Vane," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice softening. "The pressure marks I found in the library rug proved the wheelchair had been stationary for a long time, but the green silk thread I found in the curtain proved that someone in a silk shawl had been standing by the window. Elspeth was wearing that shawl. When she struck her father, she realized the shawl was stained, so she gave it to you to dispose of. You panicked and threw it in the stream, along with the surgical shears she had used to cut the silk from the snagged curtain. It was the white architectural dust on the valet's heel that truly gave you away, Julian. You had been in the library to help her back into the chair and rearrange the room, and you carried that dust from the east wing on your own boots, transferring it to the rug where the valet later stepped. The silence that followed was absolute. Elspeth slowly reached down and gripped the arms of her wheelchair. With a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, she stood up, the wool blanket falling to the floor. She looked at Miss Marple not with hatred, but with a weary sort of respect. "He would never have let us go," she said simply. "He enjoyed the power of the chair more than I hated sitting in it. Julian only tried to protect me, and in doing so, he helped you kill," Miss Marple said sadly. "It is the same story as the miller's son in St. Mary Mead who burned down the barn to hide a broken window. One lie always demands another, until the whole house comes down. You thought you were building a future, but you were only digging a grave." As Inspector Slack moved to intervene, the mystery of Blackwood Manor finally reached its end, leaving behind only the cold reality of a family destroyed by the weight of its own secrets. The morning after the arrests, Chipping Deeping seemed to have retreated into a state of collective amnesia, a defense mechanism common to small villages that have stared too closely at the sun. The Michaelmas Fate equipment was being dismantled by a crew of sombre workmen, the gay bunting now mere heaps of damp fabric in the back of a lorry. Miss Marple stood on the gravel driveway of Blackwood Manor, her suitcase at her feet, watching the mist rise from the valley. The house behind her felt hollowed out, its windows no longer watchful but merely vacant. Lady Arabella had remained sequestered in her rooms, her world reduced from a grand estate to a few square yards of morning silk. It was a conclusion that lacked the triumph of a stage play, leaving instead a lingering taste of ash and iron. Miss Marple was waiting for the local taxi to take her to the station when the vicar approached, his face etched with the weariness of a shepherd who had discovered a wolf in his own fold. He stood beside her for a moment in silence, the two of them watching a single leaf spiral down from the great oak. "It is a heavy thing to carry, Jane," he said at last, his voice barely a murmur. "I find myself looking at my parishioners and wondering what else is hidden behind those polite smiles. Elspeth seemed so fragile, so resigned. To think that such a forceful, desperate will was operating beneath that blanket all along. It makes one feel as though the very ground is made of sand. It is the nature of people to build walls, Vicar," Miss Marple replied gently, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And the stronger the walls, the more we must wonder what they are designed to keep in or out. Sir Geoffrey built a wall of control, and Elspeth built a wall of silence. In the end, they both became trapped by their own architecture. It reminds me so much of old Mr. Bentley back in St. Mary Mead. He spent 40 years building a fence to keep his neighbour's cat out, only to realise he'd fenced himself in so tightly he couldn't get his own groceries through the gate. We are very strange creatures, are we not? We value our pride and our secrets far more than our freedom." The vicar sighed, shaking his head. I suppose Julian Vane thought he was being a hero, a knight in shining armour, rescuing a damsel in distress. But he ended up just being another man with a shovel, helping to bury the truth. "Romanticism can be a very dangerous lens," Miss Marple agreed. "It blurs the edges of right and wrong until everything looks like a sacrifice. But murder is never a sacrifice, Vicar. It is a theft. It steals the victim's life and the killer's future." Julian and Elspeth thought they were taking a shortcut to happiness, but there are no shortcuts in human nature. Debt is always due, and usually with a very high interest rate. It is a pity, truly. They were both quite gifted in their own ways, but they chose to use those gifts to construct a lie rather than a life. It is the same tragedy as the young girl who worked at the draper's. She was so clever at embroidery that she thought she could stitch a whole new past for herself. She forgot that the thread always leads back to the beginning. The taxi rattle announced its arrival, breaking the morning's gloomy spell. Miss Marple accepted the driver's help with her luggage, her movements deliberate and frail, yet there was a sharpness in her blue eyes that suggested she was already moving on to the next puzzle. She settled into the back seat, looking out at the village square as they drove past. She saw Mrs. Pringle at the post office, already busy with the morning's mail and the inevitable updated gossip. She saw the cricket pitch, green and empty, waiting for a game that would not be played for long. The village would heal, of course. New secrets would grow over the old ones like ivy over a ruin. In a few years the murder of Sir Geoffrey would be nothing more than a ghost story told to frighten children or intrigue strangers. As the train pulled away from the Chipping Deeping station, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and retrieved the soft blue wool. The needles began their steady, rhythmic clicking, a sound that represented order and continuity in a world that so often descended into chaos. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of her garden, and of the familiar faces that didn't hide such dark, jagged edges. Or perhaps they did, and she simply hadn't looked closely enough at the latest crop of foxgloves. She smiled to herself, a small, knowing expression that vanished as she focused on a dropped stitch. Life was, after all, a series of small repairs, and Jane Marple was never one to leave a piece of work unfinished. The train gathered speed, carrying her away from the echoes of the manor and back to the quiet, complicated peace of her own home.